The doorbell rang again, sharp and impatient, cutting through the quiet of the house like it had every right to be answered. I didn't move. I stood a few feet back from the door, the lights dimmed, my phone face down on the kitchen counter, listening to the sound of luggage wheels scraping against the concrete outside. Someone sighed loudly. Someone else cursed under their breath. Then I heard my husband's voice, tight and controlled, asking the same question he'd already asked twice. "Why isn't the door opening?" Another voice followed, sharper, irritated. "Where is the house?" "Not where are you? Not are you okay? Where is the house?" I leaned against the wall, my heart steady in a way that surprised me. Weeks earlier, all of them had boarded a plane together, confident and coordinated, convinced everything here would be exactly as they'd left it. They had gone abroad to start something new, something they never bothered to explain to me fully. They returned expecting access, shelter, continuity. What they found instead was silence. The doorbell rang again, longer this time, as if insistence might override whatever had gone wrong. I closed my eyes and realized something that landed with quiet clarity. This wasn't panic I was feeling. It wasn't fear or confusion. It was recognition. This moment wasn't an accident, and it wasn't impulsive. It was the natural end of a plan I had been excluded from, and the beginning of consequences no one had prepared them for. I stayed where I was and let the doorbell stop on its own. Inside the house, everything felt still, grounded, unchanged. Outside, the voices shifted, overlapping now, frustration seeping through the edges. I didn't check my phone. I already knew what it would show. Missed calls, messages framed as confusion, then irritation, then urgency. None of them would ask if I was hurt. They would ask what I had done. The truth was, I hadn't done anything yet. At least nothing they could see. I had always been the quiet one in my marriage, the practical one. I handled details because no one else wanted to. Bills, renewals, schedules, paperwork. I was good at it, efficient, unremarkable in a way that made people stop paying attention. Over time, that competence became invisible. Silence was mistaken for agreement. Calm was confused with compliance. When I married my husband, I didn't just marry him. I married into his family, a tightly woven group that moved as a unit and spoke as if decisions were communal long before they ever reached the table. I wasn't openly rejected. That would have been easier. Instead, I was slowly edged into the background, included in logistics, but excluded from authority. I was useful, not central. Standing there now, listening to their impatience outside my door, I recognized the tone immediately. I'd heard it before at family dinners. In casual remarks disguised as jokes, in conversations that carried on as if I weren't sitting right there. It was the sound of entitlement meeting resistance for the first time. Someone outside tried a different approach. The voice softened, almost conciliatory. "Just open the door, we need to talk." We. The same word they had used weeks earlier when they told me about the trip. The trip had come together suddenly, or at least that's how it was presented to me. A necessary situation, they said, complicated, medical, family support. I was given just enough information to discourage questions and not enough to satisfy them. At first, it was just my husband going. Then one relative needed to come along, then another. By the end, half his family was booked on the same flight, and no one seemed concerned about the cost, the timing, or how long they'd be gone. I remembered asking, lightly at first, how everything was being arranged. My husband had smiled and told me not to worry. It was temporary. Everything would be handled. That word had come up more than once. Temporary. As if that explained the urgency, the open-ended return date, the way my presence in the conversation gradually disappeared. I hadn't argued. I hadn't pushed. Something in me had gone quiet instead. Alert in a way I didn't yet understand. People reveal more when they think you've stopped paying attention. Outside, the voices shifted again. One of them mentioned the baby, not gently, not with concern, but as leverage. I felt my jaw tighten, not with anger, but with resolve. Even now, they assumed this was a misunderstanding that could be corrected if they just pressed the right button. I finally turned my phone face up. Dozens of notifications filled the screen, names stacked on top of one another. I didn't open any of them. I sent a single message instead, neutral and brief, buying time without offering answers. Then I set the phone down again. As the noise outside ebbed into frustrated murmurs, a realization settled over me, steady and undeniable. This night hadn't begun with their return. It had begun the moment they decided I didn't need to be included in their future. Standing alone in the house they assumed would always be there for them, I understood something they still hadn't. They believed the trip changed everything. They had no idea the real shift had happened long before they ever left. I stayed where I was while the voices outside blurred into a familiar rhythm. Irritation softened into negotiation, then sharpened again when no one answered. It wasn't panic yet. It was entitlement testing its limits. I recognized it the way you recognize a song you've heard too many times, the notes predictable even when the volume changes. They weren't asking if I was okay. They weren't asking what had gone wrong. They were asking why access had been interrupted, as if something that belonged to them had malfunctioned. That tone had been a constant in my marriage, subtle enough to overlook when everything else felt stable. Hearing it now, stripped of politeness and patience, made it unmistakable. I thought about the first time I met his family, how warmly they smiled and how quickly the smiles settled into appraisal. I had been introduced as his wife, then almost immediately as the one who handled schedules, paperwork, and arrangements. Useful details, delivered as compliments. At dinners, I poured wine, coordinated rides, remembered birthdays. Decisions happened around me, not with me. No one ever said I didn't belong. They simply behaved as if my role had already been decided. Over time, that quiet exclusion became routine. When plans were made, I heard about them after the fact. When opinions were shared, mine were acknowledged and set aside with gentle efficiency. It wasn't hostility. It was something colder, a shared understanding that I was temporary in ways they were not. I remembered a comment from one holiday gathering, said with a laugh and a dismissive wave. "Things change after children," one of them had said, glancing at my husband as if the future had already been scheduled. I'd laughed along, assuming it was generational thinking, harmless and vague. Standing there now, listening to them outside my door, the memory landed differently. It hadn't been vague, it had been directional. There was an unwritten hierarchy in his family, one that everyone seemed to understand without explanation. Elders spoke, sons deferred, daughters-in-law adapted. I adapted well. I was independent, financially stable, capable. They praised that too in the way people praise something they don't feel threatened by. Independence made me convenient, not authoritative. I paid my share, covered gaps, smoothed transitions. No one ever asked how things were structured or whose name sat where. They didn't need to. Habit had always worked in their favor. My husband had never challenged that hierarchy. He wasn't cruel about it. He simply translated. When his family applied pressure, he reframed it as concern. When they dismissed something I said, he softened it into practicality. He liked harmony. He believed compromise meant survival. Somewhere along the way, compromise turned into quiet consent, and my voice became something he summarized instead of amplified. Outside, one voice rose above the others, trying authority, then humor, then frustration. I felt the old reflex stir, the instinct to smooth things over, to open the door and restore order. It surprised me how easily I ignored it. The calm I felt wasn't numbness. It was clarity. I wasn't freezing. I was choosing. I thought back to a moment I had dismissed months earlier, a conversation that had seemed casual at the time. Travel had come up, not specifics, just a loose reference to staying somewhere longer than expected. The pronouns had shifted without me noticing. "We'll see. We'll decide there. We might extend." My name had never been part of that "we." I had assumed it was shorthand. Now I understood it had been rehearsal. The doorbell rang again, longer this time, followed by a knock that carried impatience instead of urgency. Someone mentioned the baby again, louder, as if volume could turn responsibility into leverage. The implication was clear. I was supposed to respond emotionally, to prioritize their crisis over my boundaries. I felt a flicker of anger then, brief and controlled. Innocence didn't excuse manipulation. Planning had brought them here, not me. I finally glanced at my phone and watched the notifications stack in real time. Different numbers, different tones, the same underlying demand. Fix this. Explain this. Make it go back. None of the messages asked what I wanted. None acknowledged what they had done. They were all variations of the same assumption, that whatever had changed was temporary and reversible. I typed a short reply and sent it before I could overthink it. Neutral, polite, non-committal. It bought me time without offering ground. The responses came faster after that, relief mixing with confusion. They believed conversation meant negotiation. They always had. As the noise outside finally began to thin, replaced by tense murmurs and the shuffle of bags being moved again, a pattern crystallized in my mind. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the collapse of an expectation that had never been questioned. They had moved through my life as if it were an extension of theirs, secure and available by default. The moment that assumption failed, everything else followed. I leaned back against the counter and exhaled slowly. For years, I had been careful not to disrupt the balance, careful not to appear difficult. That caution had been mistaken for fragility. They thought silence meant acquiescence. They thought calm meant compliance. Outside, someone suggested they leave and regroup. Someone else argued they should stay until I came to my senses. The unity I had always associated with them cracked audibly, small fissures spreading as stress tested their alignment. I listened without satisfaction, without pity. It wasn't personal, it was structural. As they moved away from the door, still talking, still strategizing, I realized something that settled my nerves completely. The trip they believed had changed everything hadn't altered my position at all. It had only revealed it. And the longer they had assumed control without question, the harder the adjustment would be now that it was gone. They thought I had interrupted their plans. They didn't yet understand I had simply stopped preserving them. After I sent the message and stepped away from the door, my thoughts didn't linger on their frustration. They circled back to the trip itself, the question that had been forming quietly for weeks and now refused to stay buried. Why did so many people need to leave together? Not emotionally, not symbolically, but logistically. Affairs could be hidden by two people. Large movements left tracks. When my husband first mentioned the trip, it came out of nowhere, wrapped in urgency, and softened by vagueness. There was a situation abroad, he said, medical, complicated, family-related. He spoke in generalities, offering reassurance instead of details, as if tone could replace clarity. I remember nodding, listening, trying to align his words with the calendar in my head. No dates were set at first, no clear return, just a promise that everything was handled and temporary. At the beginning, it was supposed to be just him. A short stay, he implied, long enough to support someone who needed help. Then another family member needed to come along. It made sense, he said. Then another. Each addition was framed as necessary, unavoidable, decided by circumstances rather than choice. By the time the fourth name was mentioned, the pattern had already taken shape, though I didn't name it yet. What struck me wasn't the number of people, it was the ease with which the list expanded, as if the logistics had already been built to accommodate them. Flights were booked without discussion. Lodging was taken care of. Medical arrangements were described with confident finality. When I asked a practical question about how it was all being organized, my husband smiled and told me not to worry. It was temporary. We'd figure things out later. Temporary plans didn't usually require this level of commitment. They didn't usually come with open-ended timelines and quiet confidence. I noticed how quickly the conversation shifted away from details whenever I tried to anchor it. Facts dissolved into reassurances. Questions were met with affection instead of answers. It wasn't defensive, exactly. It was dismissive. The language changed as the departure approached. Pronouns slipped without correction. We'll see how long it takes. We might extend. We'll decide there. My presence faded from the grammar of the future. I told myself it was shorthand, nothing more. Families spoke like that, especially under stress. Still, the absence lingered, a gap I couldn't quite explain away. A week before the flight, I sensed impatience whenever I asked anything that resembled planning. My husband grew curt, his tone tight with something that felt rehearsed. One of his relatives hinted that I was overthinking it, that sometimes support mattered more than logistics. I stopped asking questions then, not because I believed them, but because I wanted to see what happened when I didn't. People reveal more when they think scrutiny has passed. The timing bothered me most. The departure date was precise, anchored to something unspoken. The return date remained fluid, intentionally vague. Urgency paired with flexibility was a strange combination. It suggested an event rather than a visit, something with a fixed beginning and an undefined aftermath. I felt it settle in my chest, not as certainty, but as a warning I couldn't ignore. On the morning they left, the house filled with motion. Suitcases lined the hallway, more than necessary for a short stay, packed with the kind of deliberation reserved for longer commitments. Documents were tucked into folders, not bags, handled with care. The goodbye was brief and oddly formal, lacking the reassurances that usually accompanied distance. No one talked about when things would return to normal. No one said they'd miss me. I watched them move through the space as if it were already behind them. Confidence radiated from their gestures, from the way they double-checked nothing and assumed everything. When the door closed behind them, the silence felt different from before. Not empty. Alert. I stood in the living room for a long moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house, replaying the fragments that hadn't fit. The suddenness of the plan, the expanding roster, the money questions left unanswered, the language that edged me out of the future without confrontation. Each detail alone was dismissible. Together they formed something coherent and unsettling. I didn't feel abandoned then. I felt sharpened. As the hours passed, I noticed how little communication followed their arrival abroad. No updates, no check-ins, no gratitude for the support they claimed to need. It was as if my role had ended the moment the plane took off. That absence spoke louder than anything they could have said. People who believed they were protected didn't feel the need to report back. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. They hadn't left me behind by accident. They had moved forward without me on purpose. Whatever this trip was meant to secure, it required coordination, trust, and assumption. They assumed continuity. They assumed access. They assumed my silence would remain what it had always been. Standing alone in the quiet they'd left behind, I realized something that steadied me completely. This wasn't a story about betrayal yet. It was a story about structure, about who planned and who preserved, about who asked questions and who was expected not to. They believed distance created safety. They didn't understand what distance actually created was time. Time to notice patterns, time to follow threads without interruption, time to see the difference between what I'd been told and what I'd been shown. Whatever they thought they were protecting by leaving together, they had just given me the one thing I needed to see it clearly. And once you see a plan for what it is, it's hard to unsee how easily it can fall apart. The house felt different after they left. Not empty, but exposed, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to be noticed. I moved through the rooms slowly, not searching, not snooping, just letting my eyes rest on things I had seen 1,000 times before. Silence does that. It sharpens ordinary spaces until patterns start to emerge. I wasn't looking for proof. I didn't even know what proof would look like yet. I only knew that the story I'd been given didn't match the weight of what they'd carried out the door. The notification came while I was standing in the kitchen, rinsing a cup I hadn't finished drinking. A soft chime, almost polite. At first glance, it looked routine. A shared system update. Something administrative. I would have ignored it on any other day. But my name wasn't on it. That was the first thing that felt wrong. I opened it carefully, not with dread, but with a steady curiosity that surprised me. The message wasn't secretive, it wasn't coded, it wasn't hidden behind passwords or urgency. It existed openly, casually, as if it had never occurred to anyone that I might see it. That, more than anything, told me how secure they believed themselves to be. A name appeared that I didn't recognize. It wasn't flagged as new or external. It wasn't introduced. It was used the way you use a name everyone already knows, embedded into sentences, referenced without explanation. It showed up again and again, connected to locations, schedules, confirmations. Whoever she wasn't an afterthought. She was central. I felt the air leave my lungs slowly, not in a rush of pain, but in a controlled release, like bracing for impact after already seeing the collision coming. People don't reorganize logistics around strangers. They don't build timelines for someone who doesn't belong to the plan. I didn't confront the screen. I didn't scroll wildly or search for keywords. I followed the thread the way it wanted to be followed, step by step, letting each detail settle before moving on. Medical appointments, location-specific notes, coordinated arrivals. Everything aligned neatly with the trip I'd been told not to worry about. One phrase stopped me cold. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. A delivery window. The kind of language used when something is expected, scheduled, inevitable. Not hope, not possibility, certainty. I sat down then, the cup forgotten in my hand, and let that word land fully. This wasn't speculation. It wasn't an affair hiding in the margins of someone's life. It was a timeline, a calendar built around a birth. My husband's name appeared throughout the thread, not as the organizer, but as the confirmer. He approved details. He acknowledged updates. He forwarded information without comment. There was no hesitation in his digital footprint, no questions, no pushback. He wasn't being dragged along. He was aligned. That realization hurt less than I expected. Maybe because the pain had already done its work. What replaced it was clarity. This wasn't a moment of weakness or confusion. It was a choice, repeated and supported. As I followed the trail further, the scope widened. Other names surfaced, familiar ones. Tasks were divided naturally, efficiently. One person handled housing. Another coordinated travel extensions. Someone else liaised with medical staff. No one objected. No one asked whether this was appropriate or fair. The family hadn't just known. They had participated. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling, letting a memory surface uninvited. A dinner months earlier. A toast to new beginnings. Laughter around the table. Someone's eyes flicking briefly to my husband, then away. I had smiled, assuming it was harmless, a vague sentiment everyone could agree on. Now I understood it for what it had been. Not a joke. A preview. I closed the message and took a breath, steadying myself. This was the point where most people would explode, confront, demand explanations. I didn't. I felt something settle into place instead. A rule forming quietly in my mind. Evidence before emotion. Silence before action. They had planned everything except my response. They had discussed me only in terms of reaction, not agency. How I might respond. How I would adjust. How I would eventually accept. I existed in their plan as an obstacle to be managed, not a person to be consulted. I didn't screenshot anything yet. I didn't forward it to myself or save it in a folder. I let it sit where it was, unaltered, untouched. There would be time for documentation. What mattered now was understanding the shape of what I was dealing with. I walked through the house again, noticing how ordinary everything looked. The same couch, the same light filtering through the windows. Nothing about my surroundings reflected the magnitude of what I had just learned. That disconnect grounded me. It reminded me that life didn't shatter all at once. It cracked quietly, along lines that had been there all along. For the first time since they'd left, I felt calm. They had coordinated her arrival down to the hour. They had mobilized resources, people, assumptions. They had planned for her comfort, her future, her security. What they hadn't planned for was me stepping out of the role they'd assigned without permission. I realized then that the most dangerous thing in their plan wasn't the secrecy or the betrayal, it was the certainty. They were so confident in what they believed they controlled that they never considered what they didn't. I turned off the light in the kitchen and picked up my phone, not to call anyone, not to send messages, but to set it down in another room. Whatever came next wouldn't begin with confrontation, it would begin with preparation. They had never planned around me, and that was the part they would come to regret most. I sat down at the dining table and opened my notebook, not to vent, not to write letters I'd never send, but to list. There was a difference between knowing something was wrong and knowing exactly what to do about it. Shock scattered the mind. Structure gathered it back. They assumed marriage meant shared control. They assumed family consensus meant ownership. They assumed my silence over the years had been consent. Those assumptions had carried them comfortably through every plan they'd ever made. What they never did was verify them. I began with what they believed they controlled and worked backward toward what they never questioned. Accounts, properties, access points, agreements. I didn't rush. I let each line settle before moving on, the way you do when you're assembling something that needs to hold weight. The first document I pulled up was one I hadn't thought about in years. It had been signed early in the marriage, during a period when everyone was optimistic and careful in equal measure. At the time, it had felt procedural, one of those sensible steps you take because it's recommended, not because you expect to need it. Reading it now, with fresh eyes, I felt my posture change. A clause activated under specific conditions. Authority defined with quiet precision. The kind of language that doesn't raise alarms until it matters. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt oriented. I moved through records the way I always had, methodically, without emotion clouding my judgment. I had handled logistics for years because I was good at them. Payments, renewals, compliance deadlines. I knew which systems talked to each other and which ones didn't. I knew what required dual approval and what didn't. That competence had accumulated quietly, layered over time, until it formed something solid and unseen. They had never asked what was in my name, never asked what required my authorization, never asked which protections activated automatically and which ones depended on timing. They asked about feelings. They asked about harmony. They never asked about structure. That was their blind spot. Their plan depended on continuity, on access remaining uninterrupted long enough for them to leave, settle, return, and reshape everything as if nothing had changed. Distance, they believed, created safety. What it actually created was jurisdictional delay. Time, a window where assumptions hardened and oversight loosened. I could have acted immediately. I could have frozen everything the moment the plane landed. The systems would have responded quickly, efficiently. But movement creates alerts. Stillness creates opportunity. I let everything remain exactly as it was. Instead, I verified. I confirmed names, dates, thresholds. I reviewed what triggered reviews and what passed silently. I checked which actions required explanation and which ones didn't. I made notes in the margins of my mind, not on paper, building a sequence rather than a reaction. Preparation isn't dramatic, it's patient. At one point, I caught myself staring at the screen, the weight of what I was doing pressing in unexpectedly. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't even about humiliation. It was about correcting an imbalance that had existed long before the trip, long before the messages and schedules and names I hadn't recognized. They hadn't planned to hurt me, not consciously. They had planned around me. They had assumed I would absorb the impact the way I always had, quietly, efficiently, without complaint. That assumption had been their most expensive mistake. I thought about the role I'd played in our shared life and how easily it had been misunderstood. I wasn't controlling, I was competent. I handled things because someone needed to, and because I could. Over time, that reliability had been mistaken for permanence. People confuse what always works with what can't change. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, letting the room settle around me. The house was still. My phone was silent for the moment. Somewhere abroad, they were settling in, unpacking suitcases, confident that everything back home was exactly where they'd left it. Confidence like that breeds carelessness. I made a decision then that felt counterintuitive and exactly right. I would do nothing, not yet. I wouldn't move money. I wouldn't change access. I wouldn't trigger any systems early. I would let them settle into certainty, let their routines form around assumptions that no longer held. People are most vulnerable when they believe the ground beneath them is solid. This wasn't cruelty, it was containment. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street as evening settled in. For years, I had been careful not to disrupt the balance, careful not to appear difficult or demanding. That caution had protected everyone but me. Choosing not to act immediately felt like reclaiming something I'd given away too freely, my timing. What I felt then wasn't anger. It was resolve, quiet and unyielding. I wasn't interested in confrontation or spectacle. I wasn't interested in explaining myself to people who had never asked to understand me. I was interested in alignment, in restoring order where assumptions had replaced reality. They had prepared emotionally. They had rehearsed conversations, planned explanations, coordinated support. I had prepared legally, structurally, patiently. I picked up my phone and glanced at the time difference, calculating without urgency. There was no rush. The systems would wait. They always did. As night settled fully over the house, I realized the question had shifted without me noticing. It was no longer about what they were doing, or even what they'd planned. It was about who else already knew, who had nodded along, who had participated without hesitation. That answer would come soon enough. For now, it was enough to understand the shape of my leverage and the depth of their assumptions. They believed my silence had always meant agreement. They believed my competence belonged to them. They were wrong on both counts. I turned off the light and went upstairs, feeling something close to peace for the first time in weeks. The plan was no longer theirs alone, and once a plan stops being one-sided, its outcome changes entirely. The question wouldn't leave me alone once it formed. Who else knew? Not who suspected, not who guessed, but who had known enough to act without hesitation. Plans of this scale didn't exist in isolation. They required agreement, coordination, and the kind of quiet consent that only comes from familiarity. I went back through what I'd already seen, slower this time, letting patterns speak instead of hunting for new information. Names repeated across threads with an ease that suggested routine. Tasks flowed from one person to the next without overlap or confusion. No one asked for clarification. No one pushed back. That kind of efficiency didn't come from chaos. It came from rehearsal. The realization didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. Roles had been assigned. One person handled housing arrangements, communicating with the same calm authority they used when organizing family events. Another coordinated travel extensions, adjusting dates and seating without concern for cost. Someone else managed medical logistics, using language that assumed access and approval were guaranteed. There was no central debate, no visible disagreement. This wasn't support, it was delegation. I felt something cool settle behind my ribs as the scope expanded. An affair might be tolerated in silence. A pregnancy might be rationalized. But this level of involvement meant acceptance. It meant endorsement. Whatever moral line existed for them, it hadn't been crossed. It had been moved. A memory surfaced without warning, sharp in its simplicity. A dinner months earlier, long before the trip was ever mentioned. Glasses raised, laughter circling the table. Someone had toasted to new beginnings, their eyes flicking to my husband for just a second before returning to their plate. I'd smiled, thinking it was harmless, the kind of vague optimism people leaned on when they had nothing specific to celebrate. Sitting alone now, I understood it for what it had been. Not a joke, a preview. I closed my eyes and breathed through the last of the disbelief. This wasn't personal in the way betrayal stories often were. It was structural. They hadn't acted against me in anger. They had acted without me in confidence. My husband's role came into focus with uncomfortable clarity. He wasn't the architect of the plan. He hadn't needed to be. He functioned as the access point, the legitimizer. He translated family decisions into marital language and smoothed over the gaps where consent should have been. He didn't choose between me and them. He aligned with what had always felt easier. Seeing it that way stripped the situation of its emotional fog. Hurt gave way to distance, and distance brought something steadier. You don't negotiate with a system. You interrupt it. I noticed how often I appeared in their conversations without ever being included. Discussions about how I might react, how long I'd need, what I'd eventually accept. I existed as a variable to be managed, not a person with agency. That assumption explained everything, from the casual secrecy to the confidence with which they'd left the country together. For the first time since discovering the messages, I felt the pain recede completely. Not because it had resolved, but because it had finished teaching me what it needed to. Anger required energy. Calculation required clarity. I had clarity now. They expected time. They expected access. They expected my silence to continue functioning the way it always had, absorbing decisions made elsewhere. What they hadn't accounted for was documentation, authority, timing. Their certainty was built on repetition, not verification. I stood and walked through the house again, noticing how ordinary everything still was. The couch where we'd watched movies, the hallway where suitcases had been lined up days earlier. Nothing about the space reflected the magnitude of what had shifted. That ordinariness grounded me. It reminded me that power didn't announce itself. It operated quietly, often unnoticed until it was exercised. I didn't feel the urge to confront anyone. I didn't feel tempted to expose the plan prematurely. Doing so would only allow adjustments, contingency planning, defensive maneuvers. Silence in this case wasn't passivity, it was containment. I decided then to let the operation continue exactly as designed. Let them proceed under the weight of their assumptions. Let distance stretch timelines and dull oversight. Let confidence settle into complacency. The moment I fully understood their plan was the moment I realized how easily it could collapse. Outside, the light shifted as evening deepened, shadows lengthening across the floor. Somewhere across an ocean, they were moving through unfamiliar streets with familiar certainty, believing everything important remained untouched back home. They thought the risk had passed the moment the plane lifted off. They were wrong. I picked up my phone and set it face down again, uninterested in the messages that continued to arrive in fits and starts. There would be time for conversations later, when they no longer controlled the terms. For now, the most powerful move was to remain exactly where I was, saying nothing, doing nothing that could be detected. This wasn't restraint born of fear. It was strategy. They had mistaken my quiet for weakness for years, had built an entire future on that misunderstanding. Understanding that fully changed the shape of everything. I no longer felt small in the face of what they'd done. I felt precise. As night settled over the house, I made peace with a simple truth. This was never just between two people. It never had been. And now that I could see the whole structure clearly, I knew exactly where to apply pressure. I turned off the lights one by one, leaving the house in darkness, steady and unbothered. The plan was still moving forward, just not in the direction they thought. I surprised myself with how calm I felt once the decision settled. Not relieved, not numb, just certain. Understanding the full scope of what they'd planned stripped away any urgency to stop it. If I confronted them now, they would adjust. If I raised questions, they would accelerate. Silence, I realized, would do more damage than resistance. Stopping the trip would have felt righteous, even necessary. It would have given me the satisfaction of disruption. It also would have handed them a warning. They would have moved faster, secured access, locked down assumptions that still sat loosely in place. Letting them leave did the opposite. It stretched timelines. It introduced distance. It created a gap where systems didn't communicate as smoothly and confidence dulled attention. They tested me before they left. My husband asked, almost casually, if I was okay with everything. The question wasn't about my feelings. It was about reassurance. He wanted confirmation that the ground beneath him was still solid. I gave him a neutral answer, something that could be interpreted as acceptance if that's what he needed to hear. He heard exactly what he wanted. Preparation didn't look like action. It looked like restraint. I didn't move money, I didn't change passwords, I didn't trigger reviews or alerts. I verified, double-checked, and waited. I gathered documents, confirmed thresholds, and noted which systems would respond quietly and which ones would make noise. The rule was simple. Nothing changed until they were airborne. Departure day arrived without ceremony. The house filled with movement again, but this time I watched it with a different awareness. They moved confidently, efficiently, as if the path ahead was already cleared. Suitcases were lined up with intention. Folders were tucked into bags with care. No one lingered. No one asked if I needed anything while they were gone. The goodbye was brief and oddly formal. No promises, no timeline, just a sense of completion, as if a chapter had already closed for them. I noticed how little they looked back, how certain they seemed that everything important would remain exactly where it was. When the door closed behind them, I didn't rush to the window. I didn't sit down or cry. I checked the time difference and waited. There was a moment, small but significant, when the flight status changed from boarding to departed. I felt it like a line being crossed. Once they were gone, assumptions hardened. People stop double-checking when they believe the risk has passed. Distance doesn't just separate bodies, it separates oversight. The silence that followed was telling. No immediate messages, no updates, no gratitude. It wasn't neglect, it was confidence. They believed my role had ended the moment the plane took off, which meant they had stopped watching. I walked through the house, touching nothing, changing nothing, letting the familiar space ground me. Letting them leave hadn't been easy. There was a moment, brief and sharp, when it felt like surrender. Like standing still while something important slipped out of reach. That feeling passed quickly. What replaced it was clarity. I wasn't letting go of my marriage. I was letting go of their illusion of control. For years, I had been careful not to disrupt the balance, careful not to be seen as difficult or demanding. That caution had protected everyone else. Choosing not to intervene now felt like reclaiming something I'd given away too freely. My timing. I tracked the flight without obsession, checking once, then waiting for confirmation. When it came, I closed the app and put my phone down. The moment they believed everything was secure was the moment I was finally free to act. Just not yet. I slept that night without difficulty. Not because I was at peace with what they'd done, but because the path forward was clear. Clarity does that. It quiets the noise that keeps you awake. The next morning, messages began to arrive in scattered bursts, framed as updates, small questions, casual check-ins. I answered none of them. Stillness was part of the plan. Movement would come soon enough. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, sunlight creeping across the floor, thinking about how easily silence was misunderstood. They believed it meant surrender. They believed it meant exhaustion. They believed it meant compliance. They had never considered that silence could be a choice. Letting them leave wasn't cruelty, it wasn't revenge, it was correction. It was allowing a flawed plan to reveal its weaknesses by proceeding exactly as designed. Somewhere across an ocean they were settling in, unpacking, making adjustments based on assumptions that no longer held. They thought distance protected them. They didn't understand that distance was the most valuable asset I had. I finished my coffee and stood, the house steady around me. The clock had started the moment the plane lifted off. They just didn't know it yet. When I finally picked up my phone again, it wasn't to respond. It was to note the time, calculate the window, and prepare for what came next. The restraint of the past few days had sharpened into resolve. They had left believing everything important was behind them. They were wrong. And soon, the silence they had taken for granted would speak for me. The confirmation came quietly, a small notification that the flight had landed. I checked the time difference once, not to be precise but to be deliberate. They would be tired, disoriented, confident. That mattered. Timing always did. I didn't announce anything to myself. I didn't pause for ceremony. I made the first call of the day in the same tone I used for routine matters, calm and procedural, the kind of voice that doesn't invite questions. I asked for a temporary administrative review, cited documented irregularities, and provided references that had been sitting patiently for years. No accusations, no explanations, just facts. Systems respond to facts. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It was small enough to miss if you weren't watching for it. A payment didn't clear. An automated response replaced an expected confirmation. A routine process quietly refused to move forward. I didn't celebrate. I noted it, the way you note a pulse when you're monitoring something fragile. One restriction nudged another. Dependencies surfaced. Accounts that had always spoken to each other suddenly didn't. The architecture they relied on revealed itself the moment it was asked to perform, without assumptions propping it up. Complexity amplified failure, especially when it had been built on habit instead of verification. My phone vibrated for the first time that morning with something other than background noise. A message from my husband. Tentative, framed as a technical issue. He asked if I'd noticed anything strange. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand. Confusion had replaced confidence, and it showed in the careful wording. I didn't answer him. I forwarded the message to where it belonged and let structure respond in my place. Direct communication would only muddy the process. Clarity required distance. The calls began after that, staggered and uncoordinated. Different numbers, different tones. Irritation gave way to urgency faster than I expected. Someone mentioned a delay. Someone else used the word access. The baby came up early, almost immediately, not with concern but as leverage, as if vulnerability could override process. I stayed where I was and let the day unfold. By afternoon, the pattern was undeniable. What they thought was a glitch refused to resolve itself. Someone suggested I must have misunderstood what was happening. Another hinted I was overreacting. A third warned about consequences in a voice that tried to sound authoritative and failed. They were beginning to understand this wasn't accidental, but they still believed it was reversible. They were wrong. I felt aligned, not triumphant. This wasn't punishment, it was containment. Boundaries only feel cruel to the people who benefited from their absence. I moved through my house slowly, answering emails unrelated to any of this, keeping my routines intact. Normalcy steadies the hand. The world didn't tilt or collapse just because a shift was happening beneath it. That steadiness mattered. It kept me from mistaking noise for urgency. By evening, the messages sharpened. The word freeze appeared, tentative at first, then more confidently, as if naming the problem might tame it. Someone suggested calling a lawyer. Someone else insisted we could sort it out once they were home. That last part landed with a clarity that surprised me. They were already thinking about returning. I checked the travel app without emotion and saw the changes begin. Shortened stays, rebooked flights, panic compresses timelines. The distance that had protected their certainty was dissolving, and with it, their composure. I sat at the kitchen counter and watched the city darken outside the window. I felt no urge to intervene, no need to escalate. Everything that needed to move was already moving. All I had to do was avoid interrupting it. Another message came through, this one longer, more personal. My husband tried a different approach, softer, almost apologetic, though the apology was for the inconvenience, not the deception. He asked if we could talk. I read it once and set the phone face down again. Conversations at this stage only create opportunities for negotiation. I wasn't negotiating. The family's collective response fragmented as the evening wore on. One voice tried reason, another tried pressure, another tried guilt. Crisis reveals priorities, and theirs weren't resolution or accountability. They were access and restoration. They wanted things to go back, to snap into place the way they always had. They didn't understand that the snap they were hearing was something breaking. I slept well that night, not because the situation was resolved, but because it was contained. There's a difference. Containment means the variables are known. It means the outcome is no longer hypothetical. In the morning, I checked the updates once more and confirmed what I already knew. They were coming back sooner than planned, scrambling to regain footing on ground they believed was still theirs. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it didn't move me either. Distance had done its work, systems had spoken, assumptions had failed. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching traffic move below, ordinary and indifferent. Somewhere above the clouds, they were rearranging seats and rehearsing explanations, convinced that proximity would fix what distance had exposed. I finished my coffee and rinsed the mug, the small domestic gesture anchoring me in the present. The next phase wouldn't be remote. It would be physical, immediate, and impossible to ignore. As I set the mug on the rack, a calm certainty settled into place. They had believed control traveled with them. They were about to learn it didn't. They were on their way back to a house they assumed would still be waiting. It wasn't. They arrived late, later than planned, the kind of delay that comes from frantic rebooking and miscalculation. I didn't watch the driveway or check the cameras. I heard them before I saw them, the uneven rhythm of rolling luggage, the scrape of plastic against concrete, voices layered with exhaustion and disbelief. The knock wasn't polite this time. It was sharp, insistent, edged with panic. Someone called my name, then my husband's voice followed, tight and controlled in a way I recognized from moments when control was slipping. "Open the door, we need to talk." Need, not want, not please, need. I stayed where I was, a few steps back, the house dimmed and quiet around me. I could picture them without looking. Wrinkled clothes, tired faces, eyes scanning for something familiar that wasn't responding the way it should. They had expected relief upon arrival. Instead, they'd found resistance. Another knock, harder this time. "There's a problem," someone said, as if naming it would shrink it. "The accounts, the cards, none of it's working." I let the silence stretch just long enough to settle into their bones before I opened the door. The moment I did, the questions spilled out, overlapping and uncoordinated. "Where is the house? Why can't we get in? What did you do?" My husband stood slightly behind the others, his face pale, eyes fixed on mine, as if searching for a version of me he recognized. I stepped aside and let them in without a word. They moved through the entryway cautiously, as if the space might reject them the way everything else had. Suitcases were dropped where they stood. Someone looked around, confused, as though expecting signs of damage or theft. The house was unchanged. That seemed to unsettle them more than chaos would have. My husband finally spoke, his voice low. "Something's wrong, everything's locked. The bank says there's a review, they won't tell us anything." I nodded once, "I know." That single word shifted the room. One of his relatives laughed, sharp and disbelieving. "You know? Then fix it. This isn't funny." I met their gaze evenly. "It isn't meant to be." The accusations came quickly after that. Overreaction, misunderstanding, timing. Someone mentioned the baby again, louder this time, as if volume could substitute for accountability. Another tried reason, suggesting this could all be sorted out with a few calls, a little cooperation. I listened without interrupting, the way I always had. When they finally ran out of steam, when the noise collapsed into heavy breathing and frustrated silence, I spoke. "You left," I said calmly. "You made plans without me. You moved resources without my consent. You assumed access would remain uninterrupted. It didn't." My husband stepped forward then, trying a softer approach. "This wasn't how it was supposed to go. You're blowing this out of proportion." I looked at him and felt nothing like the old pull to explain or soften. "No," I said, "this went exactly how it was built." Someone scoffed. Someone else demanded to know how long this would last. The word temporary surfaced again, like a charm they believed still worked. I shook my head slowly. "You don't get to decide that anymore." That was when the fear surfaced, naked and unmasked. Someone asked about the house, about where they were supposed to stay. Another mentioned obligations, payments, timelines collapsing faster than they could manage. The confidence they'd carried across borders had evaporated, replaced by something raw and unstable. My husband's voice cracked. "You can't do this. We're family." I held his gaze. Family doesn't plan births and futures in secret. Family doesn't assume silence means surrender. The room went very still then. The truth landed unevenly, resisted by some, absorbed by others. I could see the calculation begin, the scramble to understand what leverage remained. There wasn't any, not anymore. One of them finally asked the question that mattered, though they phrased it like an accusation. "So, what are we supposed to do?" I took a breath, steady and unhurried. "Figure out your next steps without my resources, the way you figured out everything else." They stared at me as if I'd spoken another language. The idea that they would have to solve this themselves, without access, without my quiet corrections and invisible support, seemed impossible to process. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I didn't explain further. The systems were already in place. The boundaries were already drawn. My words were simply confirmation. Eventually, they gathered their bags again, the weight of them heavier now, no longer symbols of confidence but of displacement. Someone muttered something about hotels. Someone else checked a phone with shaking hands. My husband lingered, eyes searching my face for something familiar, something salvageable. "We can fix this," he said quietly. I nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement. "You can try." When the door closed behind them, the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was resolved. I leaned against the wall and let the moment pass through me without resistance. This wasn't the end, it was the unveiling, the part where illusions finally gave way to reality. They had come back expecting shelter, continuity, restoration. They left with nothing but the consequences of a plan that had never included me. And for the first time since this began, the house felt like mine again. The days that followed were quieter than I expected, but not calmer. Silence settled in layers, interrupted by occasional calls I didn't answer and messages that grew shorter, sharper, more desperate as time passed. Panic had replaced entitlement, and with it came fragmentation. They were no longer moving as a unit. Pressure does that. It exposes fault lines. The first message that mattered didn't come from my husband. It came from one of his relatives, carefully worded, polite in a way that felt rehearsed. They wanted to talk privately, without everyone else involved. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Unity was cracking. I didn't respond right away. I let the request sit until the urgency began to bleed through the courtesy. When I finally agreed, it wasn't out of obligation, it was curiosity. Systems collapse faster when you understand where the weak points are. We met in a neutral place, not the house, not anywhere that carried memory or leverage. They looked smaller than I remembered, not physically but structurally. Confidence had drained out of their posture. They spoke about misunderstandings, about intentions, about how things had gone further than anyone expected. They never said the word betrayal. They never apologized. I listened without correcting them. When they finished, they leaned forward slightly and asked what it would take to fix things. Not to make amends, to restore access. The phrasing was careful, transactional. They were already adjusting, shifting from denial to negotiation. "I don't negotiate under pressure," I said evenly, "and I don't restore what was taken for granted." They flinched, just slightly. The conversation ended soon after that, polite on the surface, unresolved beneath it. As they left, I felt no satisfaction, only confirmation. They were looking for a shortcut. There wasn't one. My husband tried next. He showed up unannounced one evening, alone this time, standing at the edge of the driveway like someone waiting for permission to enter a space he no longer recognized. I didn't invite him in. We spoke where we stood, the distance between us physical and symbolic. He talked about stress, about fear, about how everything had spiraled faster than he'd anticipated. He admitted pieces of the truth, carefully chosen, framed to minimize intent. He said he hadn't meant to hurt me. He said he never thought I'd respond this way. "That's the problem," I said quietly. "You never thought about how I'd respond at all." He went silent then, the words landing heavier than anger would have. I watched understanding dawn slowly, painfully. Not remorse. Awareness. He asked if there was any way forward. Not together, not yet, but out of the chaos. He wanted stability. He wanted relief. I told him the truth. "There is a way forward. It just doesn't involve my silence anymore." He nodded once, as if accepting a verdict he'd always known was possible but had never believed would be enforced. When he left, he didn't argue. That told me more than any apology could have. The fallout continued in smaller ways. Messages from extended family members I barely knew, suggestions, warnings, thinly veiled threats dressed up as concern. Each one confirmed the same thing. They still believed this was about leverage, not boundaries. I didn't respond to any of it. Instead, I focused on myself in ways I hadn't in years. I restructured my days, reclaimed routines that had been bent around other people's needs. I met with advisors, not to escalate, but to formalize what had already changed. Documentation replaced assumption. Clarity replaced compromise. There was grief in that process, quieter than anger, but heavier. I grieved the marriage I thought I had, the family I'd believed I'd joined. I grieved the years I'd spent maintaining a balance that only ever tilted one way. I let that grief exist without letting it steer. What surprised me most was how quickly peace followed once decisions were made. Not happiness, peace. The absence of constant negotiation. The relief of not having to translate myself into something more acceptable. They kept trying in small ways to re-establish contact on their terms. Invitations framed as olive branches. Messages that referenced shared history without acknowledging shared responsibility. I ignored them all. Eventually, the noise thinned. People adapt when pressure doesn't yield results. They found other resources, other arrangements, other ways to manage the consequences of choices they'd made together. The system recalibrated without me. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the house quiet and steady around me, I realized something that caught me off guard. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for apologies, not for closure, not for resolution. The story had already shifted. What they lost wasn't just access or comfort. It was certainty. The belief that I would always be there to absorb impact, to clean up aftermath, to restore order quietly. That belief had structured their lives. Without it, everything felt unstable. For the first time, that instability wasn't mine to manage. I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into darkness, unafraid of what the morning might bring. Whatever came next would be built on truth, not assumption, on consent, not convenience. They were learning how expensive it was to mistake silence for weakness. And I was learning how powerful it was to stop correcting other people's mistakes at my own expense. The legal process didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with paperwork, timelines, and the kind of quiet finality that doesn't raise its voice. I welcomed it. Drama belonged to people who still believed emotion could override structure. I had moved past that. The first formal notice was delivered to an address that no longer felt like home to them. I knew because my phone lit up within minutes, my husband's name hovering on the screen like a reflex from another life. I didn't answer. Documents didn't need conversations to function. What followed was predictable. A flurry of consultations. Advice from people who spoke confidently without understanding the full picture. Suggestions that ranged from conciliatory to aggressive, all built on the same misunderstanding. That this was a conflict to be won, not a boundary to be respected. I had already chosen my position. I wasn't negotiating terms of surrender. I was formalizing separation. The paperwork forced truths into the open that conversation never had. Assets listed clearly. Responsibilities assigned without ambiguity. Authority defined where it had once been assumed. Seeing it laid out so plainly was unsettling, even for me. Not because it was unfair, but because it revealed how much of my life had been operating on informal trust instead of explicit agreement. My husband tried one last time to speak privately, requesting a meeting framed as closure. I agreed, not because I owed it to him, but because I wanted to see who he was now that the system no longer protected him. We met during the day, in public, where the weight of performance fell away quickly. He looked older, not from time, but from disorientation. People age rapidly when the roles they relied on collapse. He talked about regret, about pressure, about how things had spiraled beyond his control. For the first time, he didn't blame me for responding. He blamed circumstances, family, momentum. I listened, then told him something I hadn't said before. You didn't lose control. You gave it away. The words landed harder than accusation. He had no response because there wasn't one that didn't require him to confront his own choices. When we stood to leave, he asked if I hated him. I shook my head. "I don't," I said. "I just don't protect you anymore." That was the moment I saw it register. Not loss, release. The family reacted in waves. Some withdrew completely, cutting contact as if silence could erase consequence. Others lashed out, sending messages thick with accusation and entitlement, as if indignation could rewrite contracts. A few attempted reconciliation, offering apologies that stopped just short of responsibility. I accepted none of it. Closure offered prematurely is just another way to avoid accountability. What surprised me most was how little I missed them. Once the noise faded, what remained was space. Mental space. Emotional space. Time that belonged to me without explanation or justification. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd spent maintaining equilibrium for people who never noticed it was work. The house changed subtly as my routines shifted. I rearranged furniture not for symbolism, but for comfort. I reclaimed rooms that had become storage for other people's expectations. The space felt lighter, not because the past was erased, but because it was no longer being negotiated. There were moments of grief, unexpected and sharp. I would catch myself reaching for my phone to share something ordinary, then remember there was no one on the other end who understood me the way I needed. I let those moments pass without trying to fill them. Absence isn't always something to fix. The final documents were signed without spectacle, no raised voices, no last-minute pleas, just confirmation. When it was done, I sat alone in the quiet and felt something close to awe. Not at the outcome, but at myself, at how far I'd come without ever announcing it. They had believed power lived in numbers, in family consensus, in momentum. They had been wrong. Power lived in clarity, in knowing when to stop explaining, in choosing structure over approval. I didn't emerge from this untouched. I emerged changed. Stronger not because I hardened, but because I stopped bending where I didn't belong. As I filed the final papers away, I realized the story wasn't ending. It was narrowing, focusing, shedding what no longer fit. The chaos that had once filled my days was gone, replaced by something quieter and infinitely more stable. They had taken a trip believing it would secure their future. What it actually secured was mine. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was deliberate, earned, the kind of silence that settles after a storm has passed and the ground finally remembers its shape. I woke up one morning and realized I wasn't bracing myself anymore. No incoming crisis. No negotiation disguised as conversation. No background anxiety humming through my chest. Life didn't become dramatic or triumphant. It became stable. I started noticing small things again. The way sunlight pooled on the kitchen floor in the afternoon. The sound of my own footsteps moving through the house without hesitation or explanation. I cooked meals without considering anyone else's preferences, watched shows without pausing to accommodate someone's mood, made plans without checking whether they would inconvenience a family that no longer had a claim on my time. That was the real change. Not the frozen accounts, not the legal documents, not even the confrontation. It was the return of ownership over my own days. News traveled back to me in fragments, the way it always does when you step out of a system that once revolved around you. I heard they were staying in temporary places, relying on extended contacts, scrambling to rebuild something resembling stability. I heard my husband had moved between relatives, each stay shorter than the last. No one ever mentioned the baby directly. That story belonged to them now, and I no longer felt the need to carry it. What surprised me most was the absence of guilt. I had expected it to arrive eventually, to creep in during quiet evenings and demand explanations. It never did. I realized guilt requires doubt, and doubt was the one thing I no longer had. Every step I'd taken had been measured, necessary, and proportionate to the truth I'd been excluded from. I didn't destroy their lives, I stopped sustaining them. There were moments when I reflected on how easily everything had unfolded once I stopped explaining myself. For years, I had believed clarity came from communication, that if I just found the right words, the right tone, the right compromise, balance would return. What I learned instead was that clarity often comes from action, not argument. Boundaries don't need speeches, they need consistency. People asked me later how I managed to stay so calm through it all. I never had a satisfying answer for them. Calm wasn't something I forced. It arrived the moment I stopped fighting to be included in plans that had already excluded me. Acceptance, it turned out, wasn't resignation, it was recognition. The house no longer felt like a battleground or a symbol. It was just a place again, one that held my routines and my future without resistance. I made changes slowly, thoughtfully, not to erase the past, but to reflect the present. New habits replaced old compromises. New rhythms formed where tension used to live. I didn't rebuild my life out of spite. I rebuilt it out of alignment. Looking back, the irony still strikes me. They believed secrecy gave them control. They believed distance insulated them from consequence. They believed silence meant safety. In reality, secrecy sharpened my awareness. Distance gave me time, and silence gave me space to act without interference. That was the hidden power they never accounted for. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that revenge doesn't have to be loud to be effective. It doesn't require destruction or spectacle. Sometimes the most complete form of revenge is withdrawal, removing your energy, your resources, your emotional labor from a system that never valued them in the first place. Silence isn't weakness when it's chosen. I didn't walk away with bitterness. I walked away with clarity, with self-respect restored in ways no apology could have achieved, with a future that belonged to me again, not as an afterthought, not as a facilitator, but as the author. And if you're listening to this story and recognizing pieces of your own life in it, I want you to remember something important. You don't owe access to people who plan around you. You don't owe stability to those who mistake your strength for permanence. And you don't need permission to protect what's yours. Sometimes the tables don't need to be flipped. Sometimes you just stop holding them up. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever found strength in choosing yourself quietly, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your perspective in the comments, stay with the channel for more stories like this, and subscribe if you believe that dignity, clarity, and self-respect are worth protecting. Your silence, too, can be powerful when you decide what it's for.